Good afternoon. This is Patsy Sweeney from NERCA, and welcome to our webinar on advanced safety and HR policies for COVID-19. I want to let everyone know that you will be muted during the presentation, but you can put your questions in the box to the right and they will be answered once the presentation is over. I'm now going to turn everything over to our speakers, Trent Cotney and Benjamin Briggs from Cotney Construction Law. Trent, thank you.
Thank you, Patsy. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to NERCA. I see a lot of my friends on the line here. So, you know, when Ben and I sat and we thought about topics that would be of interest to roofing contractors, one of the things that we wanted to do was talk about not just the baseline HR and safety policies. We really wanted to get into more advanced level stuff. And our role has been very unique over the last 6-7 months. It feels like an eternity, but we have been receiving phone calls from all over the United States from roofers that have faced a variety of different issues as a result of COVID-19. Okay, when the thing first hit, we were all trying to figure out, you know, is roofing an essential business? I know I had plenty of calls from Boston area, New Jersey, New York, you know, all throughout the Northeast about this issue, and it seemed like it was changing on a daily basis. So navigating that was a big concern. After that, there was a variety of legislation that came out, from the Family First Coronavirus Response Act to the Paycheck Protection Program, all of which we had to kind of deal with. Then we followed up with a variety of contractual issues related to suspensions and delays. And now we've kind of set into what I call the new norm. And along with that has come sort of an increased awareness to understand what you need to do from both an HR and safety standpoint. I was actually talking to a roofing contractor from Massachusetts a couple hours ago, and I was having this conversation with him, and I said, look, you know, one of the things that we have to do now is, instead of waiting every year, a couple of years, to take a look at your HR manual or your safety manual, it's gotten to a point where you've got to start changing it, you know, every other month, or at least every 6 months, because of all the new guidance, the new guidelines, the new protocols. You know, Ben's going to mention there was recent CDC changes as late as yesterday. So the problem that we have in the industry is it's a little bit of a moving target, and keeping up with that target is something that's problematic. But I can tell you, regardless of what else is going on out there, and we're in election season, there's a lot of distraction, there's a lot of other stuff, focus on these issues, because it's liability. Okay, that's what we're concerned about. We're concerned about making sure that you guys are being proactive rather than reactive. And that's what we're going to focus on today. These are some things, these are real world examples. This is not academic, this is pragmatic. So feel free to ask questions throughout. Just to give you some background on myself and Ben, obviously, you know, hopefully you guys know that we're involved in roofing nationwide. Ben is our head of employment law for the entire firm. He heads up our employment law division, which includes everything from, you know, labor to employment related issues, OSHA, workers' comp, and immigration. So he is the guru when it comes to this, and he is going to be speaking up here first. Let me go ahead and move it over. Workplace safety guidelines. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ben, who's going to talk about this part, and then I will come back and talk to you about OSHA. And please, it's a smaller group. If you guys have questions, ask us. We're happy to answer them. So Ben, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. And you know, as Trent said, we're obviously talking about advanced safety and HR policies with respect to COVID-19. And I would forgive you guys if those of you listening today have some coronavirus fatigue. I know I kind of have some coronavirus fatigue myself. It feels like that's all we've been hearing about for months and months on end. But with that being said, you know, the CDC's deputy director yesterday put out a statement that COVID-19 cases are currently increasing in 75% of the country, which to me signals that this is not an issue that is going to go away tomorrow, next month, or, you know, maybe even for the next 6 months. This is something that we're talking about today that is relevant today and probably will be relevant for the foreseeable future. So again, I understand if maybe some of you guys are tired of hearing about or talking about COVID-19, But I would encourage you to stay vigilant with this, because again, this is something that we expect to be part of the workplace, part of our new norm for the foreseeable future. Now, with that being said, what we're going to talk about today, Trent and I, are workplace safety guidelines and HR policies for your companies to implement. And we'll talk about the different purposes behind those, what we're trying to accomplish by doing so. And one of the things we're going to talk about is what you can and can't do to maintain a safe workplace. Safety guidelines and HR policies kind of blend together when we talk about COVID-19. They go hand in hand. And whenever you're talking about workplace safety, you must discuss OSHA. And Trent's going to get into detail about OSHA later on in our presentation. But keep in mind that OSHA is still playing catch up when it comes to COVID-19. There are not very many, if any, OSHA specific regulations regarding this virus. So instead, what we're dealing with most of the time are the CDC guidelines, the CDC recommendations. The CDC is a federal agency that is putting out all of those different guidelines with respect to COVID-19, such as when an employee can come to work, should be sent home, when an employee's been exposed. They're putting out all this information, and as Trent mentioned, it's constantly changing. Their recommendations and their guidelines are constantly changing. So what you'll want to do is pay attention to what we're saying today, but keep revisiting the CDC website, keep revisiting the CDC resources to stay up to date, because what we say today is accurate today, but it may not be the most up to date or accurate guideline even a few weeks or a few days even from now. So keep up to date with what the CDC is recommending. And again, when it comes to determining how to handle COVID-19, the CDC guidelines are kind of a safe precaution that you can take. If you comply with the CDC guidelines, it's probably the best way to avoid potential liability or issues that go along with how you handle this virus. So we'll talk a decent bit today about the CDC guidelines, where they are right now, and what to do in light of those guidelines. But in order to follow the CDC guidelines with respect to employees, you have to first know whether or not that employee in fact has tested positive, whether that employee has the symptoms, whether that employee has been exposed to somebody else. In order to even implement these guidelines, you have to first understand whether or not a particular employee, again, has the virus, has the symptoms, or has been exposed. And in order to, basically in order to understand that, you have to obtain information from your employee. So we're going to talk about how you obtain that information, what you can ask, what you can't ask, what you should do with that information once you've obtained it. We're going to talk about that in the next minute here. But take a quick step back. It's important, I think, to keep in mind what our main goals are when it comes to this virus, when it comes to COVID-19. And from my perspective, there's three main goals that we have, and I try to keep those in mind. One is we obviously want to keep a safe workplace. You rely on your workforce to get jobs done, to basically bring business in and get it taken care of. We rely on our workforce. You want to keep your workforce safe. You also want to have your employees, your customers, other contractors you're working with, you want them to feel comfortable working for you. You want your employees to feel like you're doing what you're supposed to do, so they feel comfortable coming to work. You want your customers feeling comfortable allowing your employees, your workers on their property, doing work with them. And to the extent you're working with subcontractors, GCs, you want them to also feel comfortable working with you because of how you guys are handling the pandemic. And beyond that, we also, an additional goal is frankly to avoid liability. So the things we're talking about today, the safety policies and the HR policies, again, it's to try to protect your workforce, keep them safe, keep them healthy, keep them working. Also keep your employees, your customers, contractors you're working with, keep them feeling comfortable working with you. And in addition to that, protect from liability, whether it's a lawsuit or maybe an OSHA citation related to COVID-19. And the two main ways or two overarching steps in mitigating COVID-19 liability in the workplace is, number one, to create and maintain a clean and safe workplace. And then number two is to keep the virus out of your workplace to begin with. And I'll briefly talk about both of those right now. So with respect to that first step, again, to mitigate COVID-19 liability is to create and maintain a clean workplace. It can be done a number of different ways. You want to clean common surfaces, kitchens, door handles, shared spaces, company vehicles that are being shared, anything that a lot of people are going to be using within the workplace. You want to keep those surfaces clean, keep them clean. You want to also mandate social distancing to the extent feasible. So what that means is if you're going to have a meeting, if you're able to have people sit apart from each other during the meeting, great. If that's impossible, maybe you consider doing a virtual meeting instead of an in-person meeting. If you got a number of people riding in a truck together to the job site, if you're able to put them in multiple vehicles to do social distancing, great. If that's not possible, at least have them spread out within the cab to the extent they're able to. Beyond social distancing, you also want to mandate good hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette with masks, face covering, and also obviously, people who are, to the extent you have to cough, you have to sneeze. I kind of thought it was common knowledge how you handle a sneeze, how you handle a cough, but apparently not everybody's on the same page there. So the CDC has lots of little posters and notices you can put up, again, advising employees how to properly sneeze or cough so that those droplets don't get expressed in the air and potentially infect somebody else. And again, these are just really simple but helpful things that you can do, again, to protect your workforce. But also, if you're doing these things, they just, your employees, your customers, they feel more comfortable working for you and working with you when these measures are being put in place. And to the extent you're ever on the wrong side of a lawsuit, to the extent you can show that you've been taking these measures, it helps prevent liability to show all these different things that you've been doing in the workplace. And again, we've been talking about creating and maintaining a clean workplace. The other main part of mitigating this virus is to keep the virus out of your workplace to begin with. So, that can be done a number of different ways. First, you want to be able to identify employees who may be bringing the virus into the workplace and keep them out of the workplace. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. For one, you can have all of your employees, have them sign something in which they promise to notify you if they've tested positive, if they're exhibiting any symptoms, and if they've been around anybody who has symptoms or has tested positive. That way, they're supposed to notify you of that before they come to work, and then they don't come to work if, in fact, they've tested positive, they've been exposed to somebody, or they have symptoms. But, you can't just rely on your employees to report it to you. You also have to have your team, whether it's a crew leader, a project manager, people within the office, you have to have your team trained as to what the symptoms of the virus are so they can spot them in employees. And if they see them, they can take action to remove that employee from the workplace before they spread the virus to others. And in addition to that, you can also take the additional step of doing temperature checks. You can do temperature checks of your employees on a daily basis, could be, typically at the beginning of the day. And if they have a high temperature, 100.4 degrees is kind of the threshold. If they have a high temperature, that's a telltale sign of COVID-19. And that's one of the things you can test up front. And if somebody has a high temperature, you can keep that employee off the job site, out of the office, out of the workplace, so they don't spread it to other people. You can also have your employees fill out a daily pre-job checklist where they, check off and sign and date at the end, whether or not they have any of these symptoms. You can have a whole list of symptoms on your little one-page checklist. Yes or no? Do you have fever? Do you have a high temperature? Do you have a cough? All those things, a yes or no answer, and whether you've been around anyone who's tested positive. Things like that, again, like a pre-job checklist on a daily basis, helps you prevent people who shouldn't be in your workplace from being there. You can help weed them out ahead of time to prevent the virus from spreading. And again, you're also helping your other coworkers feel more comfortable at work because they know you're putting all these precautions in place to help keep them safe. And again, we've talked a decent bit about obtaining information from your employees because that is critical to keeping the virus out of your workplace is obtaining information from your employees. And generally, pre-COVID, employers are very limited in what they can ask their employees when it comes to personal questions or health questions. Normally, I would not be advising you to take your employees' temperatures every day, or to ask them medical questions every day. Normally, that's not something that employers are supposed to be doing. However, because of the pandemic, the rules have changed, so to speak. The Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, the EEOC, which is a federal agency that enforces discrimination laws and retaliation laws, they've actually come out and stated up front that because of the pandemic, employers are allowed to ask certain questions and obtain certain information, such as temperature checks from employees. But that doesn't mean that you have carte blanche freedom to ask whatever you want, or after you've obtained the information, do whatever you want with it. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about what you can ask, what you can't ask, and then once you have that information, what are you supposed to do with it? So when it comes to the questions you can ask, the main rule of thumb is that if the question you are asking goes directly to whether or not this individual has the virus or has been exposed to the virus, whether the employee is in fact a danger to your workplace potentially, that question is okay to ask. So you can ask them, whether or not they have any of the symptoms of COVID-19, or whether or not they've tested positive for the virus, or whether or not they've been around anyone who has tested positive for the virus. You can't ask them is general health questions that don't relate specifically to COVID-19. You also don't want to ask them whether anyone in their family has tested positive or has those symptoms, because that's a question that doesn't necessarily relate to whether or not your individual employee's been exposed. Instead of asking them whether anyone in their family has it, you want to ask them whether anyone that they live with has it. Because again, their family could be asking them questions about their medical history or genetic, their family genetics, which is something that you're not supposed to do. So again, keep it very narrowly tailored to whether or not that employee himself or herself has the symptoms or is tested positive, or anyone that employee is living with or has been in close contact with has the symptoms or is tested positive. That way you can ask questions you're permitted to ask without wandering into the danger zone, if you will. And once you've obtained that information, whether it's verbally asking them questions or having them complete and sign a pre-job checklist or a questionnaire, or obtaining information through temperature checks, these are all different ways you can obtain information. Once you've obtained that information, you now have certain duties as to what you do with that information. One of the duties is that you have to protect the employee information. Keep it confidential to the extent possible. So what that means from a practical standpoint is, if you have an employee who has told you or has in their written job checklist indicated that they have tested positive for COVID-19, you are not supposed to tell other people in the workplace, their coworkers or whatnot, that this individual, that Bob Jones tested positive for COVID-19. What you can do, and what the CDC wants you to do, is determine who was in close contact with Bob while he was working for you. And then you want to let those employees know that they may have possibly been exposed to COVID-19, but you want to do so without divulging Bob's name. You don't say Bob tested positive. You just say, we've obtained information that indicates you might have been exposed to COVID-19. We're letting you know that. We're asking you to go home and you can get tested or take whatever measures you want to take, but you're informing them of their exposure without identifying the individual. Again, you're keeping that information confidential. Now, the employee might know exactly who you're talking about. Bob might have told everybody who it was, or the employee it might be a two-man crew, so it's obvious who it is. But again, you as the employer have an obligation to not be the person or the entity that is divulging that confidential information. If they figure it out from some other source or just using basic reasoning, that's fine, but you've basically maintained and complied with your obligation to keep that information confidential. Additionally, any information you obtain from your employees, whether it's a question or in writing or temperature checks, that medical information is supposed to be maintained in a separate file or separate folder from the employee's general information. So, typically for an individual employee, you might have a personnel file for that one employee. This medical COVID-19 information you're obtaining from that employee or about that employee should be maintained in a separate file from the employee's general personnel file. And, again, this is what the law requires you to do. So simply because you, given the pandemic, can obtain more information from your employees than normal, you still have restrictions on what you do with that information once you've obtained it. And to avoid liability, potential lawsuits, and things of that nature, it's important to understand how to treat that information once you have it. Now, again, if you've obtained information that indicates that an employee, in fact, has tested positive or has the symptoms of the virus or has been exposed to somebody, you want to take certain steps once you have that knowledge. First of all, you want to keep that employee out of the workplace. Again, that helps protect your workplace, keep it from spreading to other employees. And again, by doing that, you're helping limit your liability. It's not going to be a good situation if you know that somebody has the virus or has the symptoms or has been exposed, and you allow them to continue working, and then now the customer at the job site they were at gets sick, or one of your coworkers gets sick. That's where you have some potential liability. Whereas if you have the knowledge of the employee being positive or having the symptoms and you keep them out of the workplace, you've now eliminated or greatly at least limited that liability. Beyond keeping the employee out, if you've determined that the employee was working while they had the virus, you want to close off that area or close off the equipment that the employee used while the employee had the virus. You're supposed to wait 24 hours after you've closed off the area to then clean and disinfect the area equipment. Again, that's what the CDC recommends. So if the area or the equipment that the employee used, could be a truck, could be a tool, whatever it might be, if you're able to separate that, to basically close it off, don't let anyone else use that area or that equipment, that tool, for 24 hours, then clean it and disinfect it, and then now it can be open again for people to use. Again, that's what the CDC recommends, and to the extent you're able to do that, you again will limit the spread of the virus, limit your exposure. You'll make your customers, your employees feel better if you're putting those methods or those measures in place. Beyond that, you want to also determine whether or not any coworkers were exposed to the employee who you've now learned, when you learn an employee has the virus or had tested positive, you want to find out if any of the coworkers, other employees of yours, have been exposed to that employee. And if so, you want to, you want to tell that employee or those potentially exposed employees of it without divulging the employee's name, which we just discussed a minute ago. So again, you don't want to tell them Bob tested positive, but simply tell them someone tested positive, or frankly that you've learned that they may have been exposed. You can just leave it at that. Now, what exposed means has changed over the months, and it changed again just yesterday. So previously, what the CDC had defined as exposure, meaning that the sick employee, you're analyzing, again, we'll use Bob. Bob tested positive for COVID-19. We're trying to determine who was Bob around while he had the virus. Previously, the CDC defined exposure as close contact, being within 6 feet for a prolonged period of time, which the CDC defined as 15 or more continuous minutes. So you previously were going to be looking at, okay, who was Bob within 6 feet of for 15 minutes or longer at one time? The CDC updated their guidelines, their recommendations just yesterday to change that 15 minutes from being 15 continuous minutes to now being just 15 total minutes. So if Bob was around Joe 3 different times during the day for 5 minutes each, under the new guidelines, Joe has been exposed to Bob, whereas under the old guidelines that were there just a couple days ago, Joe would not have been exposed. So again, this is a good example of how the CDC guidelines continue to change and why it's important to keep up to date on what those guidelines are. So now going forward, the analysis is when somebody in your workplace lets you know that they tested positive, or when you do a temperature check and they have a high temperature, they have symptoms of the virus. Now you're trying to determine who have they been around within your workplace. And that analysis requires you to determine who has that symptomatic or that positive employee, who have they been within 6 feet of for a total of 15 minutes in a 24-hour period. So you look at a 24-hour period. At any point collectively in that 24-hour period, if they're around somebody for 15 minutes or longer in total, that other person has now been exposed. And the CDC recommends that you have employees who have been exposed. If the employees who have been exposed are supposed to be excluded from the workplace if you're able to, sent home, kept at home in order to prevent the virus from spreading. Again, that's what the CDC recommends you do if you've determined that an employee has in fact been exposed. And to kind of summarize what we've talked about so far, we want, again, to do whatever we can to protect our workplace, to keep our employees, our customers, contractors you're working with, keep them comfortable and limit your exposure. There's a handful of ways that we've talked about that you can do that. One is to post and distribute COVID-19 safety material. Make sure your team, your employees understand what the symptoms of the virus are, how to clean and sanitize common areas, how to do coughing and sneezing etiquette, hand sanitizing. Give that information out to everybody. Again, it helps protect your workplace. And again, it protects from liability to an extent where you can show that you've provided all this material to your employees. Beyond that, again, like we said before, social distancing, respiratory etiquette with masks, face coverings, those are things that, again, to the extent you're able to do, will prevent the virus from spreading, will make everyone feel more comfortable working with you, and will also prevent liability or limit your liability. We also touched on the fact that you can have your employees sign something where they agree to promptly notify you if they have any COVID-19 symptoms or if they've been exposed to COVID-19, and they agree to not come to work unless they're authorized to do so. By having your employees sign something like that, if the employee in fact comes to work with the symptoms, at least you can show that you had them sign something ahead of time saying they wouldn't do that. And again, you're kind of building that paper that paper coverage to limit your liability by at least having everybody sign something agreeing to not do that. The pre-job safety checks we talked about earlier, as well as temperature checks, again, are another good way to mitigate the potential spread of the virus. And finally, what I mentioned earlier is to train and instruct leaders to identify COVID-19 symptoms and to send sick employees home when they've been identified. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Trent to discuss the applicable OSHA standards and get into more detail on what you want to do with respect to OSHA.
Well, thank you, Ben. That was a lot and always informative. Obviously, if you guys have questions, Ben will stick around. He's got a little bit more he's going to talk about at the end here. I'm going to turn it over and talk to you about OSHA. OSHA is something that we as a firm do a lot of, and we've got 20 offices all over the U.S. and 2 in Canada. Obviously, OSHA in Canada is a lot different, but I can tell you here in the States, we have seen a big uptick in COVID-19 related violations. Okay, I believe you saw a stat, or if you haven't seen it recently, OSHA issued about $900,000 in OSHA citations to a variety of different companies in various industries, some of which were construction. So what I want to do is I want to kind of take you through some of the issues, help you identify what to do and what not to do. And for those of you that have seen me speak in the past, you know that one of the things that I always try to hit home is the party with the best paper wins the day. Okay, and what that means is it doesn't matter whether it's a lien claim, it's an employment related issue, it's OSHA, it's a delay claim that you might have, whatever it is, if you have the paper to support your position, if you have it in writing, regardless of whether it's email or digitally, that is going to go a long way to helping prove your case. Okay, and that's one of the things I want to hit home here. I said it at the outset, you need to make sure that your safety manual is updated. Okay, your safety manual has to be updated. So let's get into it. As Ben mentioned, there is not a specific standard that has been designed by OSHA to specifically deal with COVID-19. Okay, and there's reasons for that. The reasons are primarily that it takes a long time for the rulemaking process to go through what it has to in order for a standard to come forward. So what OSHA has done is they've primarily looked at the CDC guidance and they've said that's kind of what we're going to follow. But in addition to that, They are looking at a variety of different Code of Federal Regulations provisions, and I'm talking based on the Federal Act right now, that they have looked to enforce, okay? A great example of this is the General Duty Clause. The General Duty Clause basically says that as an employer, you have a duty to make sure that you have a workplace that is free from recognized hazards, okay? You want to ensure that you are doing everything in your power to keep your employees safe. And clearly, everybody on the line, and myself included, we all want our employees to go home safe every single night. Okay, there's no question there. In addition to that, there are a variety of other provisions within CFR that a lot of the investigators have looked at. One is personal protective equipment. And we've had some recent citations that have been issued against contractors based on the failure to have the appropriate level of PPE when the potential for exposure is larger, okay? If you go to the link that I've got there at the top, okay, and obviously you can't click it because you're watching a PowerPoint, but if you go to that link, there are other guidance that OSHA has provided. One of the things that they provided early on was a risk assessment of the jobs that you're doing, okay? If you are a residential roofing contractor, or if you're doing a commercial tenant improvement, okay, the risk that your employees are going to be exposed to COVID is relatively low, okay? That has one set of requirements. Clearly, if you are required to wear PPE for other reasons, you have to do that, okay? If you are in a jurisdiction that may be requiring mandatory masks, that's another issue, okay? When I say PPE, I'm referring to the N95s and above. That's the kind of, I'm not talking about one of those cloth masks or gaiter that you put on to semi-comply with whatever the local rules are, okay? After that, there is a second tier where OSHA has said, look, if you are in a high traffic area, so let's say you are working on a grocery store, or you're working on an Amazon warehouse, or you're working somewhere where there's a significant amount of traffic, then you may need to take additional precautions because the risk for exposure may be greater. Okay, and then the highest level, and we've had a lot of issues that we've had to deal with on this type of project, is where you're working on a nursing home, you're working on a hospital, you're working on any place where the risk to the public and the potential exposure to your workers is greater than it would be normally. Okay, right now we are representing several roofing contractors in massive lawsuits related to fatalities that happened at a nursing home facility as a result of COVID-19. Okay, you don't want to be in that situation. So this gives you some basic guidance, but let's drill into it a little bit more. One of the things that you obviously have to do is maintain your OSHA logs, and OSHA record keeping requirements mandate that if you have a work-related injury or illness, you must report it on your 300, right? Everybody knows that. So the question becomes is whether or not you have a work-related case of COVID-19. It is very, very difficult to determine how you got COVID-19. Okay, now there's some things that from a common sense standpoint, you can look at and say, okay, it's pretty clear that John Smith got COVID-19 on the job because every other crew member got it, he didn't have it, and now he has it. Okay, that's kind of clear, okay? But if you're not absolutely certain, then you want to think very hard about how you go about reporting this, okay? COVID-19, I go on to say here that COVID-19 can be a recordable illness if a worker is infected as a result of working on the job. Okay, however, they're only responsible for recording cases if all of the following are true, all of the following. The case is a confirmed case of COVID-19. So it can't be that the guy was coughing, sneezing, he felt bad under the weather. It's got to be, you got to have a confirmed case, okay? Second point, the case is work related. I gave you some examples of that as far as the crew. And the third is that the case involves one or more general recording criteria set forth, okay? And this is basically, you know, was it a recordable injury? So if they are asymptomatic, then that's not necessarily an injury, okay? If COVID-19 was caused through work-related duties, normal reporting requirements apply as far as hospitalization and fatalities. So remember the requirements for hospitalization and fatalities. And again, I am talking to you based on the federal guidance, okay? NERCA consists of many states in the Northeast. Some of you are state plans, some of you are federal, okay? Hospitalization, 24 hours from the time of admission. Fatality, 8 hours from the time that it occurs. You have to report to OSHA. Okay, and I'm giving you the simplistic version, but that's the case. I want to talk to you about job site safety in particular. You need to really think about your job site and think about possible areas for exposure to COVID-19 from your other crew or personnel that are out there and from third parties. Okay, one of the things I really think that the job site trailer is going to be a thing of the past. I really do. And the reason I say is, you know, every job site trailer I've been in is a petri dish to begin with. I can only imagine if you got one of those now with COVID-19. So you're just asking to have a bunch of germs and viruses and illnesses and God knows what be spread to other people. So if you have a job site trailer, you want to make sure that access is limited because it is the perfect design to spread COVID-19. All job site meetings are virtual to the extent that you can. Okay, obviously, you know, if you have to do a job site meeting, make sure you're properly distanced, maintain social distancing. But look how we're talking now. I don't remember if this is GoToWebinar or Zoom, but that's how we communicate. This is like the 5th or 6th one of these I've done today where I'm on Zoom or Teams or Google Hangout. I've been on every single one, you name it. And it's very, very easy to communicate this way. It's also, and a lot of times it's more efficient, okay? If anyone on the job site appears ill, this includes your subs, okay? If you've got a sub that doesn't look right, send them home, okay? It's not worth getting some more production out of a sub crew just so you can meet schedule if you have to shut the whole job site down because of COVID-19 and the customer don't want to pay you because of that, okay? So you need to be alert not only for the people that are on that job site that are your employees, but as far as other people as well, okay? And interface with their management to ensure that that happens. Ensure that your workforce arrives with all the proper PPE and water that they need, okay? During the summer, I actually had quite a few phone calls from, you know, the Boston area, definitely in New Jersey and New York, with heat-related injury and illness. And that normally happens every summer anyway. You know, we would usually get 1-2 calls a week during the hottest months of the summer. But we started getting 10 or 11 a week. And that's when I turned to my OSHA team and I said, look, something's going on here. We need to figure this out. And what we figured out is that it was the COVID-19 rules. So a lot of the contractors were removing the communal water. They were requiring workers to wear masks at all times. And, you know, that obviously is required in jurisdictions, but did create some ambient heat issues and some dehydration issues. So the message I'm sending you is make sure that everybody gets to the job site with their own PPE, their own water, or you've figured out ways to make sure that you don't have a communal water supply, that the water is safe to be used on the job site, and mandate hydration breaks, mandatory hydration breaks. This is also critical during the winter, okay? You'll be surprised how fast you get dehydrated during the winter, and you never would think that because it's cold outside. You don't notice it like you do during the summer months, but we have a lot of dehydration calls during the winter. So this is something to keep in mind. You got to make sure that your crew leader, your superintendent, project manager, whoever it is, understands that you have to have mandatory breaks. Daily reporting. Daily reporting is one of those things, if you're on a commercial job, you do it every day, okay? Or every week, whatever it is. Oftentimes it's paper, but there's no reason why you can't switch to virtual. And let me give you a practice pointer here, and please pay attention to this part, okay? Daily reporting is your opportunity to put your best foot forward, okay? I can't tell you how many lost opportunities I've seen to talk about what a great safety program you have, to talk about the fact that you did a safety audit that day and everybody passed, to talk about the COVID-19 precautions that you're doing, to record the fact that you've got an extra work claim or a change order in your daily report, okay? Use it as CYA, okay? I live in a world of CYA. That's my full-time job. Daily reporting is a great way to do that. Is it the end-all be-all? Is it going to get around notice provisions and contracts? Not necessarily, but it gets you in the game, man. That's all I'm looking for, is just give me something that I can work on. And daily reporting is a great way to do that. So why not, in addition to talking about what you completed that day and who showed up on the job site, say, we had multiple safety checks today. You know, everyone had the proper PPE. We had sanitizer stations on the site. We sanitize the job site both before, during, and upon completion. All that kind of stuff is great, because if you end up with a government inspection or a bad guy lawyer decides to come after you, then you got some self-serving documentation there to help you out, right? It's about, unfortunately, roofers have to be lawyers now, okay? And the reason is because every owner, and if you're a residential contractor and you're listening to this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We've got a bunch of Google lawyers now, right? You know, how do I screw a roofer out of money? You just type that into Google, it'll give you 25 different ways to do it. So you have to think like a lawyer yourself. And part of this is being proactive rather than reactive, making sure that you are thinking about it from a liability standpoint. Taking a step back, your HR personnel, your safety personnel are fantastic. Okay, they are focused on HR, they are focused on safety. They're not necessarily focused on liability, okay? So one of the things that you need to remember is, I'll give you a great example. We had a serious injury OSHA matter that we were dealing with. The safety director is a fabulous safety director, does a great job at safety, but proceeds to go and interview all the people that were on the job site, then writes a report that's basically damning on the company, saying that it failed to follow through with all this other stuff, and you know, a bunch of other things that weren't necessarily required. Now, the safety director meant well there, and part of that was probably to cover his own butt because of the safety violation. But guess what all that documentation is? It's discoverable. So OSHA gets that. OSHA gets all of that. So thank you, Mr. Safety Director. You just made my job a lot more difficult. Okay, what is the best process to do that? Okay, the best process to do that is, if you want to interview employees, coordinate with your lawyer and have the employees' interviews that are done after the fact in writing sent to the lawyer as part of their attorney work product and attorney-client privilege. So you have the capability of shielding them if necessary. Make sure your safety director and your HR director knows that anything they put in writing is potentially discoverable. So you always have to have that liability hat on. Now, let me take a step back. I'm not talking about, you know, hiding stuff. I'm not talking always tell the truth. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you have to be able to control what you say in writing, because it may not be 100% accurate, and it may be more than is necessary. Another great example is OSHA logs, okay? If you have somebody that you are not certain has been hospitalized or injured as a result of COVID-19, and you've done a sufficient amount of due diligence, that's something I probably wouldn't put on an OSHA log unless you're certain, okay? If you're certain that it happened, then so be it. If not, then you've got to kind of parse through that. There's a lot of gray area there. And there is some additional guidance that you can see on OSHA.gov that talks about that. Meetings over 10 people, what I would do is move to virtual to the extent that you can. You know, I'm speaking to you in our headquarters now. We got roughly 25,000 square feet. There's a roofing contractor literally across the street. I see them having meetings out in the parking lot, and they're socially distanced. That's fine, okay? But why not take advantage of technology? Okay, it's so efficient, it's so easy. And like you know, like me, I'm sure you guys are sick of doing these kinds of things, but it ends up saving you a lot of time and money. And if you think about it this way, if you're paying a bunch of your people to go to a job site where they could just hop on Zoom, you're saving yourself money because you're not having to pay them travel time. Okay, think about it that way. To the extent you can, discontinue in-person safety training. Obviously, a lot of it has to be in person, okay? We got a training center out back. There's some things that I can't imagine doing virtually because you just can't get the feel of it, okay? You can't get the feel of how to put on a harness. And trust me, I've put on one wrong, and you only put it on wrong once. You guys know what I'm talking about. That's the kind of thing where you gotta be in person. You can't do that virtually, but there's a lot of stuff you can do virtually. So think about ways that you can do that to help yourself. Obviously, sanitizing and cleaning the work site. And what I mean by that is, don't go spraying Lysol on a pile of rubble. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is if you've got common surfaces, okay? If you got a nail gun, if you got a ladder, your crew cab, any of that kind of stuff, you want to sanitize it before the job, and you want to sanitize it after the job. And what that does is it gives your customers a sense of assurance, and it gives your employees a sense of insurance. Have a sign-off sheet. Okay, I'm going to give you some documentation later. You can have a sign-off sheet that says when you inspected that job, who inspected it, and what they did. You know, just like when you go into Walmart in the bathroom, it's the same idea. Okay, and what that does is it creates accountability, and it also creates certainty for your customers. Use it as a selling point. Everybody hates lawyers. This is a great way to turn legal and safety into a selling point, especially with a concerned customer. With COVID-19 safety, you want a written safety plan that I recommend it in all circumstances. You want a written safety plan that talks about not only your home office, how you're going to deal with that, but about your job sites, okay? The key elements to the safety plan is you want engineering controls. What kind of barriers are you going to put in place? Are you going to use plexiglass? Are you going to socially distance? What are you going to do? Okay, administrative protocols. What is the sanitation schedule? Are you going to go through and sanitize different areas? What are you going to do to make sure that people have access to disposable masks, gloves, whatever they might need in order to feel safe? And then PPE, I mentioned a little bit earlier. Face shields, respirators, advanced level N95s and 100s, whatever it might be, make sure you have access to that, okay? Early on, there was a run on N95s or K95s, depending on what you use. And I got asked the question a lot, well, do I give mine up for professionals, hospital professionals? Yeah, absolutely, okay? That is more important, but I believe that those shortages have dissipated, okay? That's what I am hearing, okay? What OSHA has said that in the event that you cannot get access to certain PPE, they're going to look at your best efforts. They're going to see what you did to try to address whatever the concerns are. Supporting forms and documentation is absolutely critical, okay? And in addition to giving you all this guidance, I'm giving you some free documents here, okay? And this is stuff that we spend a lot of time on. So job site specific hazard analysis and risk assessment matrix, the sanitation checklist and verification forms, toolbox talks. You need to have specific toolbox talks on COVID-19 safety, and you need sign-off sheets on that. Training worksheets and employee acknowledgements. How to safely reopen. If a lot of places are shutting down. Chicago's shutting down again Friday. They're reverting back. I don't even know if they'll be able to go to restaurants on Friday. There's a lot of other places that are doing that. If you end up going backwards, how do you safely reopen again? Okay, you want to make sure you got those plans in place. And localized compliance. If New Jersey has certain rules that New York doesn't, and you do work in both states, you want to make sure you understand what those requirements are. Here is the infectious disease preparedness and response plan. Okay, we put this together, our employment group and OSHA group put this together. And the idea behind this is not the Bible. You can change it, you can do whatever you want to with it. But the idea behind this is it gives you a baseline to show you some of the things that you need to have in your plan. Keep in mind that this plan is self-serving, right? It shows what you're going to do, but it's also for anybody that comes knocking on your door wanting to learn about your safety, okay? So if you have OSHA or your state equivalent saying you're unsafe because some employee has filed a whistleblower complaint, you get to show them things like this, okay? And it was interesting, I just sat on, I think it was last week, tongue kind of stands still during COVID-19, but I was on the Department of Labor stakeholder meeting for OSHA COVID-19 whistleblower. And the comments were incredibly interesting. They are actively pursuing this. We have a handful of cases right now based on COVID-19 whistleblower cases where employees did not feel safe and reported it to OSHA. In addition to the great citations and stuff that we put in there, we go on in here and we talk about the certificate of COVID-19 training. Okay, doesn't happen unless you have it. It didn't occur unless it's in writing. Just remember that from a liability standpoint, didn't happen unless it's in writing. Okay, and the reason I say that is I'm being facetious, but having the writing is the difference between a maybe and a yes, that did happen. So this gives you a great checklist. Again, you can add, you can take it away, you can change it to local standards, but this gives you some insight into what I would like to see from our clients when we get called by them for an OSHA COVID-19 violation. Sanitation and inspection report. I just mentioned this, right? This is one that we kind of designed for your home office where it shows, hey, this is what we've done. Here's the checks. It looks just like that thing on the back of the door of the bathroom in Walmart. And that's the idea behind it, okay? And you can do the same thing for the job site. Put it on the job box, say, hey, this is what we're doing. Keeps that customer happy, okay? In addition to that, you want to know exactly what the consequences are. So you talk about the different consequences, and we created a risk assessment matrix. Okay, that even sounds professional, right? A lot of it is how you word things. A risk assessment matrix, that scares me. So that's the kind of stuff that you want, because again, it's not just about creating standard operating procedures for your company. It's about showing the outside world that you care. That's going to be important here, because one of the big things that we're going to continue talking about is your potential legal liability from third parties. Okay, some of the states in NERCA have already addressed that through legal liability shields. Others have not. The federal government has not yet. Okay, we've been working to try to get this passed. And one of the things that, obviously everybody's focused on the election. We'll see what happens, but talk to your state representatives and senators, as well as your federal ones, and make sure they understand that the roofing industry wants a legal liability shield, okay? Because we don't want bad guy lawyers suing roofing companies for third-party exposure. That's another webinar, don't get me started. Sample toolbox talks, okay? If what I gave you before wasn't enough to impress you, then how about this? Okay, it's a sample toolbox talks on COVID-19. Okay, this gives you all the great things that you want to learn about. Obviously, stuff changes, as Ben mentioned to you. CDC just changed its guidance recently. So these are the kinds of things that you want to look for and make sure that you are talking about. Again, the most important thing that you can do is have the sign-off sheet. Doesn't count if you can't show they were present. So make sure that they sign off, make sure you make copies of it and you put it in the employee box or digital copies. We are as close to paperless as you can get. And I can't tell you how much money we're saving as a result. Okay, it's a painful process, but if you can go cloud-based and paperless and maintain security, then you're going to end up saving money and be a lot more nimble. What I've seen is that fluidity, mobility is a force multiplier. And hopefully you'll see the same thing as we continue to drudge through COVID-19. This is a toolbox talk in Spanish. Many of you have Spanish speaking only crew members, okay? And this, I gave Spanish because it tends to be the dominant language for crew, but I know many of you may have Albanian crews or may have Hungarian crews, or I don't care what the language is, do it in their language, okay? Do it in their language, because ultimately OSHA is going to see whether or not you talk to them in the language that they are familiar with. If you didn't, then how can you show that you properly train them? Okay. Safety and return to work. Some things to keep in mind is that OSHA did do some additional guidance, and I'll put you the link here. What you want to do is assess existing hazards, figure out where the points of potential problems are. So, for example, in our kitchen, we removed a few chairs. We tried to distance it as much as we could. We added sanitizer stations throughout the office. We have some staggered workers. That's another thing that you can do, is stagger work times. We've allowed people to work from home to the extent that they can. And we're not overly demanding about that, because we want flexibility for purposes of having people to feel safe and remain part of the group. Keep in mind that flexibility is absolutely key here, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you feel like the employee feels like that they're being retaliated against. Okay, anti-retaliation is something that is on the tip of every employer's tongue right now. So keep that in mind. Compliance with guidelines. Is that you, Ben? Okay. So you want to continually check with the CDC, OSHA, the Department of Labor. NRCA and NERCA's websites are great for purposes of checking stuff out. And I recommend highly that you continue to go to these organizations, CDC and OSHA in particular, to get the latest and greatest. Okay, discuss with your crew and implement standard operating procedures for working in each jurisdiction that you're in, because the rules can literally change as you walk down the street. Okay, recognize that these rules change per county, per state, and even though I don't know what will happen in the election, I've always believed that you just tell me what the game is and I'll figure out how to play it. But you can expect more of the same regardless of who is in office. I think you're going to continue to see divisiveness as far as safety protocols, regardless of what happens here in a couple of weeks. Crisis management team. Okay, crisis management team. Briefly, and I know we don't have too much time left, one of the things you really want to do is pick who you need to be in charge of issues related to COVID-19. Okay. One of the key things is you've got to have a second in command. If the person listening to this goes down for 2 weeks or hospitalized because of COVID-19, who is going to pick up your slack? Okay. For me, it's Ben. That's why I got him over here. Okay. He's gonna jump in and he can have it. Okay. But that's the key thing that you need to do. Okay. Develop a remote system for work. Now's the time to embrace technology. Okay. Many of you may say, it's for the birds, but this is the world we live in now. You've got to do it. You got to evolve, and this is the time to do it. And you'll see that ultimately you'll save yourself a lot of money. Determine what happens if you can't get to the office. We had this happen a lot with some of the protests that occurred. You may have it in your jurisdiction because of COVID-19 or whatever it might be, but what happens? You know, if you're still on that QuickBooks desktop version from 2002, it's time to upgrade to the cloud. Okay, you've got to figure stuff out like that, because if it's not COVID, it'll be something else. So now's the time to think about it. Work with your suppliers. Okay, we have had a variety of materials escalate as a result of COVID-19. Lumber is through the roof. Okay, softwoods, you know, plywood, OSB, all that stuff. We've seen prices go up across the U.S. With the tariffs being reinstituted on aluminum, you can expect a lot of sheet metal prices are going to go up. We had a run on fasteners during COVID-19. Okay, so all this kind of stuff, you got to have great relationships with your suppliers. Determine what happens if your supplier shuts down. Who do you go to after that? Okay, and then we talked about toolbox talks on HR and safety. Absolutely critical that you stay in front of all your employees for purposes of advising them of the latest and greatest as it comes to COVID-19. Now we get to Ben, and Ben, we are right at 2, so I'll let you summarize this and we'll wrap up.
All right, so as Trent mentioned, I'm just going to be real brief with you guys today. Obviously, with the pandemic coming through, there's been a whole lot of new laws, new regulations, new federal guidance related to COVID-19. And as a result, there's been a whole lot of new HR issues related to COVID-19. Your employment policies have been affected by COVID-19. And we're going to touch quickly on some of the main ones and just kind of flag those for you. Because frankly, to get into a detailed or nuances of these different HR issues would take hours, and while I would enjoy it, I'm pretty sure nobody else listening would. So we're just going to touch on some of the main issues again, just to flag them for you, so you can make sure that you and your team are aware of these issues and have the protocols in place to handle them when and if they arise. So one of the main issues affected by COVID-19 is time off and paid leave. COVID-19 has required a lot of employees to be taking time off when they wouldn't be normally taking time off. And the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is a federal law that was passed back in March, went into effect in April, it brought with it new paid leave laws. So there are a handful of different situations related specifically to COVID-19 that entitle employees to paid leave, to job-protected paid leave. You need to be familiar with those 5 different situations and how to handle them when they arise. Again, I'm not going to get into detail as to those 5, but just keep in mind that of those, 4 of them entitle an employee to up to 2 weeks of paid leave. The 5th reason entitles an employee to up to 12 weeks of paid leave. For some of the reasons, an employee is entitled to full pay while they're out. For other reasons, they're entitled to 2/3 pay. And all of these paid leave laws or different circumstances that came into play with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, all of that paid leave has a corresponding tax credit available to you as the employer. So again, it's important to understand what those leave laws require so that you don't violate the law and find yourself on the wrong side of a Department of Labor investigation or a lawsuit, and also so that you can take advantage of that tax credit. Beyond the paid leave laws that came about with COVID-19, you need to keep in mind that a lot of the old laws that have always existed are still in place and in full effect. So the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, is in place for when an employee misses time for a health issue or to care for somebody else with a health issue. And so this can go beyond just the paid leave, 2 weeks of paid leave that we talked about. An employee might also have a claim to FMLA leave because of COVID-19, whether it's affecting them individually or one of their family members. And FMLA leave is unpaid leave, but it still is leave that you are required to offer to your employees if you are covered by the FMLA. Not every employer is covered by it, but if you are covered by it, keep in mind that COVID-19 creates a new reason that might trigger FMLA leave. Similarly, COVID-19 could potentially trigger a qualifying disability that requires a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So when you have an employee who's bringing up health issues they have related to COVID-19, you have to keep in mind that this could possibly qualify, depending on the circumstances, as a qualifying bona fide disability that requires you to provide a reasonable accommodation, if possible, to that employee. In addition to all of this, when we have employees who are working from home or working part at home, part in the office because of COVID-19, because of the pandemic, you have to make sure that you are still complying with wage and hour law requirements. If you had employees who typically worked in the office, had punched in, clocked out, now they're working from home, you have to still track their hours. You have to find a new way to track all hours being worked by your employees, even if now they're working remotely when they used to be working in the office. Because again, those wage and hour laws are still in place. You still have the same record keeping requirements, minimum wage, overtime requirements that you always had. You just now have a different set of circumstances to navigate in order to comply with those laws. And similarly, when you're obtaining employee information related to COVID-19, when you're possibly claiming a tax credit, you have to obtain certain information. There's COVID-19 specific employment information that you are required to keep and maintain for different sets of time periods. And it's important to make sure that you and your team understand those different record keeping requirements with respect to COVID-19 and how to comply with them. And again, we've talked about these different HR issues that have come up because of COVID-19 with the federal paid leave laws, with the FMLA, the ADA. Another one to keep in mind is age discrimination. This has popped up a lot in the context of COVID-19, where I've seen a number of companies decide to cut hours for their older employees, or to furlough their older employees, or to lay off their older employees with good intention. They see the older employees as being at risk, and so if anyone's going to have to work less or take some time off, they want it to be the older employees to try to protect them from COVID-19. Again, that makes sense. That's a reasonable thing to go for, but the problem is that can be the basis for an age discrimination claim. So again, COVID-19 has given rise to age discrimination issues that weren't there before. And again, when it comes to obtaining and protecting employee information, we talked about that before. Because of COVID-19, you are obtaining a lot more information about your employees than you would normally. You have to make sure that you and your team have the protocols and procedures in place to protect that information and to avoid liability. And I'll let Trent just finish up here with the last word we have, and we're going to sign off. Thanks for listening to us, guys. And if anyone has any questions on anything that I talked about with related to HR and employment, just be sure to let us know and we'll get it taken care of.
All right, stick around for a little bit, Ben, because I'm sure we'll have some questions here at the end. So with that, we want to turn to you guys and see what questions we have. Obviously, we covered a ton. If there is any questions we can answer for you, we are here. So
I just unmuted everybody, so they should be able to ask the questions if they haven't.
all right.
Anybody have any questions?
Well, if you guys think of something afterwards, this is how you get hold of us. Always happy to talk to any roofing contractor out there. So anybody in the industry, give us a call. Happy to talk.
All right, thank you, Trent. Ben, it was great.
Thank you, Patsy. Always a pleasure.